Laura, an experienced and deeply devout nurse, has always had a close relationship with her son, Raphael. From an early age, she taught him the values of faith and the power of prayer. For Laura, faith in God was an anchor in her life, something that helped her face the daily challenges of her profession and personal problems. However, Raphael, now a young adult, grew up skeptical of any form of spirituality. He was a firm believer in science, logic, and verifiable facts. For him, everything in the world had a rational explanation, and faith was just a consolation for those who did not understand the laws of nature. Even with the differences between them, Laura never stopped sharing her faith with her son. She prayed for him constantly, asking that one day he would understand what it was like to have God in his life. But Raphael, on the other hand, avoided these conversations, believing that life could be lived fully without depending on something invisible. In his mind, relying only on what his eyes could see and what his hands could touch was enough. While Laura saw her faith as a source of hope, Raphael saw it as something outdated. For him, advances in science were proof that humanity no longer needed belief in something greater to survive. He often commented that if the universe was so vast and complex, why would a divine being worry about such small details of each person's life? These questions that her son asked often hurt Laura, but she never argued. The nurse preferred to remain serene, waiting for the moment when Raphael, in some way, experienced the power of God for himself. Raphael's friends shared the same disbelief, which reinforced his conviction that faith was something dispensable. They laughed together at people who attended church or believed in miracles. Raphael saw his mother as a loving person, but he couldn't understand why someone so intelligent still believed in something that, in his eyes, was irrational. For Laura, however, God's love was something that could not be measured by science. Still, she knew she couldn't force Raphael to believe. He needed to find his own way. Faith is not imposed, she said to herself. It is discovered, and that was exactly what she wanted. That Raphael, one day, would have an experience so strong and inexplicable that it would change his view of God. Even during her long nights on duty at the hospital, Laura took advantage of every moment of silence to pray for her son. Her co-workers, many of whom were also religious, often supported her on this spiritual journey. They knew how difficult it was for Laura to deal with a son who didn't believe in the same thing as her. But they also admired her for her patience and persistence in not giving up. The coexistence between mother and son continued to be marked by this contrast between faith and science. But the love they felt for each other was genuine and deep. Raphael, despite his disbelief, respected his mother's dedication as a nurse and the affection she always showed. Laura, in turn, understood that each person has their own journey and that, over time, Raphael could change. While Laura's faith remained unshakable, Raphael continued his life focused on his career and the rational challenges of everyday life. Little did he know that, soon, he would face a situation that would put all his beliefs to the test, leading him to question everything he thought he knew about the world and the power of the invisible. Laura and Raphael had a loving relationship, but it was often marked by discussions about faith and spirituality. While Laura saw her belief in God as the basis of her life, Raphael, always skeptical, saw faith as something outdated and unnecessary. He firmly believed that everything in the world could be explained by science, and there was no room for the supernatural or the divine in his view of the universe. For him, everything was a matter of logic and reason, and whenever he got the chance, he teased his mother with challenging questions. If God really exists, why does he allow so much pain and suffering in the world, Mom? Raphael questioned with a challenging look. Laura, in turn, maintained her calm and serenity. For her, faith was not a matter of simple logic, but of trust in something greater. Not everything is to be understood immediately, my son, she replied patiently. Sometimes the answer comes through faith, and it is this faith that gives us strength to face difficulties. These talks often ended in an impasse. Raphael believed that his mother was holding on to an illusion, while Laura, firm in her belief, felt that Raphael had not yet experienced something that touched his heart deeply. She knew that forcing her son to believe would not bring results, so whenever he provoked her, she responded with love and understanding. Science explains a lot, Raphael, But not everything, she said with a calm smile. Faith fills the spaces that science cannot reach. Raphael, however, was irritated by these answers. For him, faith was just an excuse to avoid difficult questions. He prided himself on being a practical person who depended on facts and evidence. In his world, there was no room for the mysterious or the unknown. And the more Laura talked about her trust in God, the more he felt the need to prove that everything had a logical explanation. Have you ever seen God, Mother? Has he ever appeared to you and answered your prayers personally? Raphael said in a sarcastic tone. Laura sighed, used to her son's skepticism. I see God in many things, Raphael. In the miracles that happen in the hospital where I work, in the recovery of patients who had already been misled by doctors. Science has its role, but there are moments when only faith can sustain us. These words, however, didn't seem to penetrate Raphael's mind. For him, his mother's faith was just a form of self-deception. He respected his mother, but couldn't understand why she refused to see the world in a more realistic way. And for him, that meant accepting that everything that existed was what could be measured, touched and tasted. Despite the constant arguments, Laura never lost her patience. She knew that Raphael's path would be different, and that he would need to find his own answers. Deep down, she believed that, at some point, something would happen that would open her son's eyes. One day you will understand, Raphael, she said, always hopeful. I can only hope that when that day comes, you will be willing to accept what cannot be explained by science. Arguments between mother and son became a routine. Raphael did not miss an opportunity to challenge his mother's faith, and Laura, with her calm and loving posture, continued to respond with wisdom and patience. For her, these conversations were just part of Raphael's path to eventually finding faith. She prayed for him daily, asking God to reveal his power in a way that Raphael could not ignore. And although Raphael remained firm in his disbelief, Laura kept hope alive. He knew that when the time was right, God would manifest himself in his son's life in ways he could never hope for or deny. Raphael led a life completely focused on his career as an engineer. He was the type of person who firmly believed in the power of logic and facts, and anything that fell outside that spectrum had no place in his reality. In the work environment, he stood out for his competence and rational view of things. The world, for Raphael, was a set of mechanical parts, where everything fit together perfectly if you understood the rules that governed how it worked. For him, faith was one of those archaic things that people used as a kind of emotional crutch, something that science and reason should replace. Among his co-workers, Raphael felt even more validated. Most of them shared the same perspective. Discussions about faith and spirituality rarely came up, and when they did, they were often followed by laughter or sarcastic comments. Everyone preferred to talk about technological advances, the company's new projects, and how science was the way to the future. Raphael felt comfortable in this circle. He believed he was on the right path, that his pragmatic view of the world was the only correct one. In his mind, everything in the universe could be explained with an equation, a formula, or a well-founded theory. When something unexpected happened, such as a sudden illness or a tragedy, he convinced himself that medicine or the laws of nature had a clear explanation for it. And that's exactly how he handled his personal life too. His mother's faith, for example, was for him just a desperate attempt to find comfort in the midst of the uncertainties that life provided. When Raphael visited his mother, he would see her praying or going to church, and he always wondered why she wasted so much time on that. For him, Laura was an intelligent woman, but this part of her life, where faith occupied a central space, didn't make sense. Sometimes he even felt a little sorry for her. If only my mother understood that we don't need religion or a God to keep us firm. Science can answer everything, thought Raphael, without realizing that his own vision was limited. While Laura sought peace and meaning through faith, Raphael believed that the only path to peace was the absolute certainty that everything was under human control. Chance did not exist. Destiny was shaped by rational choices, and God? Well, for him, God was a figment of the past, something people created when they didn't have answers for things. Now, in the 21st century, these answers were available to everyone. It was just a matter of knowing where to look. Raphael's friends respected him for his focused outlook, but he knew that sometimes his practical approach to life took him away from more emotional or spiritual issues. While others dealt with personal crises by seeking comfort in faith, he simply couldn't understand why people wouldn't accept reality as it was. He didn't care what people thought about his lack of belief. He was comfortable with who he was and his conviction that everything in life came down to a series of causes and effects. This rational confidence gave Raphael a sense of control. He believed that if he followed the right steps, everything in his life would follow the predicted path. Science and planning would ensure success in your career, and personal effort would ensure that your life would remain in order. In fact, he was proud of never having needed God to achieve what he wanted. For him, the idea of giving in to faith was a weakness, an admission that things were out of control. Raphael had built a comfortable bubble around himself, where everything made sense. But what he didn't realize is that life is often unpredictable, and that sometimes forces beyond our understanding can intervene in surprising ways. His inflexible logic and denial of his mother's faith were a reflection of his own need to maintain control over everything, not realizing that life doesn't always fit into the exact molds we create. Although Laura continued to pray for her son, Raphael remained trapped in the idea that there was nothing beyond what he could see, measure, or calculate. He was content with that, until the moment his life began to change in ways he could never have predicted. Raphael, who had always prided himself on having his life under control, suddenly found himself facing a situation that he could neither predict nor resolve with his rational approach. An unexpected crisis shook your world in a brutal way. Perhaps it was a sudden illness that left you debilitated, or a serious accident that affected your mobility and your ability to continue with your routine. Or perhaps he had lost someone very dear to him, someone whose presence he had always taken for granted, and now he felt the emptiness and pain of loss. Either way, his once perfectly structured and predictable life began to fall apart. At first, Raphael did exactly what he always did. He looked for practical and immediate solutions. He consulted specialists, underwent tests, took the right medications, and followed all the steps recommended by science and medicine. After all, that's always what worked before. But this time, nothing seemed to be enough. Increasingly, he felt that no matter how much he followed logical guidelines, the problems continued to grow, and his ability to control the situation was slowly unraveling. Frustration took over Raphael. He couldn't understand how, with all his preparation and knowledge, things had gotten out of hand. He had done everything right, followed all the rules, and yet he was watching his life fall apart before his eyes. Worst of all was the feeling of helplessness. For the first time, Raphael felt that his rationality was not capable of offering him the answers he had always found so easily. As the crisis progressed, Raphael's mind became overwhelmed. He couldn't think clearly, and his usual confidence in scientific answers began to shake. Sleepless nights, thinking about how to resolve your situation, became a routine. The solutions he normally found easily now seemed distant, as if there was something bigger, something he couldn't understand or manipulate, that was interfering with his life. His mother, Laura, noticed the change in her son, and, despite Raphael's earlier teasing about his faith, she silently continued to pray for him. She knew this was the moment he could finally understand that not everything is in our control, and that there are forces beyond what the eye can see. However, Laura also knew that Raphael needed to come to this conclusion alone. She did not try to impose her faith, but waited patiently, trusting God to guide her son's path. Raphael, on the other hand, didn't want to accept this idea. Even in the midst of the crisis, he refused to believe that anything other than science could help him. But at the same time, he couldn't deny that something was missing. One night, he found himself reflecting on the conversations he had had with his mother over the years, about her faith and how she always seemed to find comfort, even in the most difficult situations. As he struggled to find a way out of his problems, Raphael began to feel emotionally exhausted. The weight of trying to resolve everything alone, without success, was becoming unbearable. He wasn't as sure as he used to be, and that scared him. His unyielding logic, which had once guided him with confidence, now seemed empty. Raphael realized that no matter how hard he tried, there were things he simply couldn't control. and it made him feel a deep sense of vulnerability. In the following days, Raphael continued trying to maintain his rationality, but despair began to grow. He no longer felt the same. Doubt, which he had always considered a weakness, now took over his thoughts. He began to realize that maybe his mother had been right all along. Maybe there was something he didn't yet understand, something that couldn't be explained by science. Now, Raphael was faced with an internal dilemma. Continue fighting with the tools he knew, even if they weren't working, or finally open himself to the possibility that, perhaps, there was something beyond pure reason. Laura watched, with a heavy heart, Raphael's increasing suffering. She knew that her son was facing an internal battle much greater than the external adversities that presented himself. As a mother, it was difficult to see him so lost and distressed, especially knowing that he refused to give up his rationality to try to find solace in faith. Laura knew that science had its value, but she also firmly believed that faith was what brought peace and hope in times when nothing else seemed to work. She approached him at a time of great fragility. Raphael was sitting in the living room, with his eyes fixed on nothing in particular, lost in thoughts that probably revolved around his helplessness in the face of the crisis. Laura, with her always calm and loving posture, sat next to him and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "Son," she said, her voice soft and tender, "maybe it's time for you to try something different. We may not always understand what is happening in our lives, but sometimes we need to let God guide us." Raphael, visibly dejected, just shook his head in disagreement. He had never believed in God, and even now, with his life crumbling around him, he couldn't accept the idea that anything other than his own strength could solve his problems. "Mom, I understand that you believe this, but it doesn't make sense to me. How can faith in something I don't even know exists help me now?" Her voice was filled with frustration and disbelief, but Laura was unfazed. Patiently, Laura spoke about her own experience with faith. She shared stories of times when, even with no solution in sight, her trust in God helped her weather the worst storms. "I know it seems difficult to understand, Raphael, but faith is about trusting, even when we don't have all the answers. Sometimes God works in ways we can't immediately see, but He is always there, waiting to help us." Raphael, although still skeptical, felt a small touch of doubt in his own conviction. He had always prided himself on being logical and rational, but now, deep down, he began to question whether his logic was enough to deal with the pain and despair that consumed him. He didn't respond to his mother, but his expressions revealed an internal battle between his pride and the possibility that perhaps there was something more. Laura realized this and, without forcing it, decided that her role at that moment was to continue to support her son, regardless of the choices he made. The days passed, and Raphael's crisis continued to deepen. Laura, without giving up, prayed every day for him, asking God to reveal His power in a way that Raphael could understand. She knew that the change would have to come from within him, but she believed that God would find a way to touch her son's heart, even if Raphael was resisting so much. For her, faith was never something imposed, but something that flourished when most needed. Despite his resistance, Raphael could not completely ignore his mother's faith. He saw her as a beacon of strength, even in the most difficult times. The serenity with which Laura faced life's challenges intrigued him, because, unlike him, she seemed not to despair in the face of adversity. In her mind, a small voice began to question, "What if she's right? What if there is something beyond what I can see?" On a particularly difficult night, Laura found Raphael in tears in his room. Her mother's heart almost broke when she saw her son, always so strong, fall apart like that. She hugged him without saying a word, letting him vent all the pain he was suppressing. After a few minutes, Laura whispered, "God is here, Raphael. He always has been. You just need to open your heart and allow Him to help you." Raphael, in that moment of extreme vulnerability, did not resist. For the first time in a long time, he closed his eyes and, even without knowing how, he allowed himself to say a silent prayer. And it was at that moment that he began to realize that his mother might have been right all along. That night, Raphael felt more lost than ever. Anxiety and despair prevented him from sleeping, and he tossed and turned in bed, unable to find peace. As he stared at the ceiling, the rational thoughts that had always comforted him no longer made sense. He was on the verge of an emotional breakdown, and, with no alternative, he began to wonder if perhaps his mother was right about God. Eyes heavy with exhaustion, he finally fell asleep, sinking into a deep, restless sleep. In the middle of the night, Raphael had an intense and vivid dream. He found himself in a vast, empty field where everything seemed calm and silent. Suddenly, a bright light appeared on the horizon, growing until it completely surrounded him. He felt enveloped by a presence he couldn't explain, a feeling of absolute peace, something he had never experienced before. He didn't see anyone, but he felt a comforting presence, as if someone was there, watching and protecting him. Even in the dream, Raphael knew that this was not common. At the height of the dream, the light became so strong that he could no longer see anything. He felt immersed in a feeling of unconditional love, something that no scientific explanation could describe. Raphael tried to speak, but there was no need for words. Deep in his soul, he understood that he was facing something much bigger than himself, bigger than everything he knew. He felt tears run down his face, but this time it wasn't from despair. It was from something he couldn't name, but knew was real. When Raphael woke up, he felt his heart beating faster. The dream had been so real, so clear, that he couldn't dismiss it as just an illusion. He sat on the bed, his body sweaty and his heart full of conflicting emotions. His rational mind wanted to find a logical explanation for what had happened, but his heart knew that something deep within him had changed. He could no longer ignore the possibility that God was trying to communicate with him in a way he could finally understand. In the following days, Raphael became distraught. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened that night. He didn't share the experience with anyone, not even his mother, but he began to notice subtle changes in his own behavior. The fierce skepticism he had always carried seemed to be weakening, replaced by a new, nagging curiosity. He began to notice signs around him, little coincidences and inexplicable moments that seemed to echo the dream experience. On one occasion, he was driving to work when a song came on the radio, talking about faith and hope. The lyrics seemed to speak directly to him, as if it were a message sent especially for that moment. This left him so stunned that he stopped the car on the side of the road, trying to process what was happening. For the first time, Raphael felt like the universe was trying to show him something he had never allowed himself to see. That night, he decided to talk to Laura about what had happened. Hesitantly, he shared the dream and how he had been affected by it. Laura, upon hearing her son's words, held his hands gently, her eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "Raphael, this is God. He has always been with you, and now he has shown you the way in a way you can understand," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Raphael was silent for a moment, processing what his mother had said. Although he was still trying to find answers, he could no longer deny what he had felt. The supernatural experience had broken the wall of disbelief he had built up over the years. "I don't know what to believe yet, Mom, but I know I can't ignore what happened. Something is changing inside me," he admitted, with a mix of fear and hope. Laura smiled, understanding that this was the beginning of a new journey for her son. She knew that God had begun to work in Raphael's heart, and now it was up to him to open himself completely to this new reality. Raphael woke up every morning with a strange feeling in his chest. What was once an unshakable certainty about God's non-existence now seemed to crumble, giving way to internal confusion. He wondered if the dream was just a creation of his exhausted mind or if there really was something greater, something divine, trying to communicate with him. But the more he tried to rationalize the experience, the harder it became to explain what he felt that night. Logic, his old ally, no longer seemed sufficient to answer the questions that now invaded his mind. As he drove to work, he tried to block out these thoughts by turning to what he knew best: the physical world, practical solutions, and logical reasoning. But when he stopped at a traffic light, he saw a church on the horizon and, for a moment, he felt an inexplicable connection with the place. "Is this just a coincidence?" he thought, almost automatically. But then he remembered the dream, that intense light and the presence that seemed so real. And that bothered him deeply. At work, Raphael immersed himself in spreadsheets and projects as a form of distraction. But in moments of silence, his mind always returned to that night. What did that mean? His years-long disbelief was being challenged in a way he didn't know how to handle. He couldn't just ignore what he had experienced, but he also couldn't accept it completely. It was as if his world was slowly falling apart, and he no longer knew what to believe. In the following days, discussions with his mother began to change tone. Before, he had teased her dismissively about her faith. But now, the teasing had given way to sincere questions. "Mom, do you really believe that God talks to people this way?" he asked one day, almost in a whisper. Laura, always patient, noticed that something had changed in her son's heart and responded tenderly, "Yes, Raphael, God has ways of reaching us, and sometimes he does it in ways that we can't immediately understand." This answer, while comforting him, made him even more uneasy. Raphael couldn't explain how something so intangible could be so powerful. He had lived his entire life believing that everything had a scientific explanation, but now he found himself surrounded by unanswered questions. His feelings were divided. One part of him still clung to logic, while another part, growing stronger, began to accept that maybe, just maybe, there was something beyond what he could see or touch. He began to pay more attention to the little coincidences in life, something he previously ignored completely. Conversations with friends and colleagues seemed to somehow reflect his internal struggles, as if the universe was sending him signals. This is crazy, he thought, but at the same time, he felt like he was being guided in a new direction, one he would never have chosen on his own. One night, while alone in his apartment, Raphael found himself looking out the window at the starry sky. It was something he rarely did, but that night the stars seemed to shine differently. He sat down on the couch and, for the first time in years, said a silent prayer. It wasn't a full prayer, just a simple sentence. "If you're really there, show me." He didn't know what to expect, but for the first time he felt a little more at peace, as if he had taken the first step on a long journey. The following days brought more clarity. Although Raphael was still far from completely accepting the idea of God, he began to notice that his initial resistance was breaking down. He was, for the first time, allowing doubt to enter his heart, not doubt about God, but doubt about his own certainties. And this new openness, this emerging humility, made him realize that faith and science did not need to be in conflict, but rather coexist in harmony. Raphael's internal confrontation didn't end all at once, but he knew he had taken a big step. His spiritual journey had begun, and he felt deep in his heart that his life would never be the same. He still had a lot to learn, but he was now willing to listen and see beyond what his physical eyes could show. Raphael was nervous. He was never one to share spiritual feelings or experiences, especially with his mother, who was so devout. But he felt he needed to talk about what happened. A feeling of relief mixed with anxiety overwhelmed him as he approached Laura's house that afternoon. He knew she would be understanding, but he feared appearing weak or vulnerable, something he had avoided his entire life. Upon entering the house, Raphael was greeted by the affectionate look of his mother, who, noticing the seriousness on her son's face, invited him to sit on the sofa. "Son, what happened?" she asked, her voice calm but full of concern. Raphael hesitated for a moment, looking for the right words to describe what he had felt, but soon decided to be honest. "Mom, I went through something strange. Something I can't explain." Laura listened to him in silence, her heart beating faster as Raphael spoke. He told about the experience that shook him to his core, about how, for the first time, he felt something beyond logic and reason, something that made him question everything he believed. He talked about the dream, about the inexplicable feeling of divine presence, and how it left him confused and divided. "I don't know what to think, Mom. I've always lived my life based on reason. But now it feels like there's something more," he admitted, his voice shaking with uncertainty. Laura, with teary eyes, smiled tenderly. She knew this moment would come. "I always knew God would show up for you, Raphael," she said softly, taking his hand. "I pray for you every day, And I know he has always been watching you. What you felt is not weakness, my son. It is the beginning of a new journey, a journey of faith. Raphael lowered his eyes, trying to process his mother's words. He had always seen her faith as something naive, but now, after his own experience, it seemed like there were more layers to spirituality than he realized. But, Mom, how can I believe in something that I can't prove? I always believed that everything needed evidence, logic, he confessed, still struggling with his internal conflict. Laura shook Raphael's hand firmly, looking him in the eyes with a serenity that only a mother can have. Raphael, faith is not contrary to reason. They go together, but sometimes we need to accept that there are things beyond our understanding. Not everything can be proven, and that doesn't mean it's not real. True peace comes from recognizing that there is something bigger than us, something that guides us and protects us, even when we can't see it or understand it. These words moved Raphael deeply. He began to realize that his mother had never denied science or logic. She just believed that the world was vaster and more complex than her rational mind could comprehend. He began to see faith as a new way of understanding, one that complemented what he knew rather than challenged it. For the first time, he felt he could make room in his life for something beyond reason. The conversation continued for hours, with Laura sharing her own faith experiences, how she always knew there was a greater force watching over her and her family. Raphael, still a little skeptical, but now more receptive, listened attentively, absorbing every word. Little by little, he began to feel a slight comfort in knowing that he didn't need to have all the answers. Maybe faith was exactly that, accepting that some questions remain unanswered and still feeling at peace. When night fell, Raphael felt exhausted, but in a different way. It wasn't the usual physical tiredness, but a feeling of emotional relief. He finally allowed himself to admit that he didn't have all the answers, and that was freeing. Laura, noticing the change in her son, hugged him affectionately and whispered, "God has always been with you, even when you didn't believe, and he will continue to guide you, even if you still have doubts." Raphael left his mother's house that night with a different feeling, something he had never experienced before. There were still many questions in his mind, but now he was willing to seek answers not only in science but also in faith. And, above all, he knew that his mother would always be by his side on this new journey, with patience, love, and of course, faith. Raphael, after his remarkable experience and the deep conversation with his mother, begins to feel a transformation in his life. For the first time, he decides to open his heart to something he has always rejected: faith. At first, he still feels skeptical and full of questions, but the restlessness that once tormented him gives way to a genuine curiosity about what spirituality could offer him. The first time he accompanies his mother to church, Raphael feels a little uncomfortable. The environment, the loud prayers, the expressions of devotion, it all still seems strange to him. However, he observes Laura's serenity, who, with her eyes closed and her calm smile, connects in a way he doesn't fully understand. Her tranquility makes him reflect. Is there something there that he hasn't yet been able to see? As the days go by, Raphael continues to accompany Laura to church and, little by little, he becomes accustomed to the rituals and the atmosphere. During preaching, he finds himself thinking about topics that he always considered outside his reality. Words like faith, forgiveness, and purpose begin to resonate in a different way. He begins to realize that life is perhaps much more about what cannot be seen, rather than what is easily understood. Meanwhile, in his everyday life, Raphael begins to notice subtle changes. Situations that once frustrated you now seem less important. The answers he always sought through logic, he begins to find in acceptance. Raphael realizes that, often, it is necessary to trust what cannot be controlled. This new perspective helps you better deal with the pressures of work and personal life. Laura, observing her son's spiritual growth, does not hide her joy. She sees him as calmer, less critical, and, above all, more open to experiences that he would never have considered before. Although Raphael still has his reservations and doubts, he admits that he is feeling lighter, less tied to the certainties that previously governed his life. The process is not quick, and it is not always easy, but every day he comes closer to the faith he despised so much. During the following weeks, Raphael begins to pray on his own, even if timidly and uncertainly. At night, he finds himself reflecting on his life, his choices, and now, God's place in it all. He realizes that spirituality does not need to be a total renunciation of logic, but rather a way of complementing what reason cannot encompass. Eventually, Raphael begins to open up to the teachings his mother shares. He reads excerpts from the Bible, attends religious studies, and participates in deeper conversations about life, death, love, and forgiveness. Increasingly, he feels that this new journey is not just about believing in something greater, but also about finding peace within himself, something he has never experienced before. Raphael's transformation is not abrupt, but it is evident. He becomes more patient, more understanding of others and himself. Your old certainties give way to humility, to the recognition that life is full of mysteries and that not everything needs to be explained. He now understands that there are times when one must simply trust, let oneself be led by faith and hope. Now, attending church regularly, Raphael feels more at peace. He doesn't have all the answers yet, but he has learned that this is part of the spiritual journey. Surrendering to faith does not eliminate your doubts, but it gives you a new way of looking at them. Raphael realizes that living by faith is more about learning to live with uncertainty, rather than seeking to control it. This new perspective on life brings him a tranquility he never imagined possible. Alongside Laura, he discovers that faith, far from being a sign of weakness, is a source of strength and wisdom. Raphael transforms into a man who now not only understands the importance of faith, but also lives it, day after day, with a more open heart and full of hope. Raphael, now at peace with his new beliefs, finds a surprising balance between his rational life and the faith he has come to embrace. He realizes that spirituality is not in opposition to science, but that both can coexist, offering different perspectives on life and its complexities. His analytical mind remains a valuable tool, but his heart is now open to something bigger, something that goes beyond what he can prove or measure. At work, Raphael is still the brilliant and dedicated engineer, but with one noticeable difference. He has become more patient and understanding. Faced with professional challenges, he no longer seeks to control everything, but trusts that there is a greater purpose in each difficulty. This change in posture brings calm, and his colleagues notice that he has become a more calm presence, someone who offers support without the arrogance of before. The transformation does not go unnoticed at home either. Laura, his mother, proudly sees her son who once mocked his faith now living with more compassion and humility. They share moments of prayer and reflection, and Raphael often seeks his spiritual wisdom to better understand what he still cannot explain. This new connection between them strengthens the family bond, something that previously seemed weakened by discussions about belief. Raphael himself comes to understand that faith fills the gaps that logic cannot reach. He realizes that there are issues in life, such as purpose, love, and suffering, that cannot be completely understood by science. Spirituality, for him, becomes a way of dealing with human fragility and the uncertainties that everyone faces. The control he once believed he had now gives way to a greater trust in something divine. In moments of silence and introspection, Raphael prays and reflects, something he never imagined he would do. These breaks from your busy routine give you a new perspective. He realizes that faith does not require him to abandon his reasoning, but that it teaches him to balance his mind with his heart. The peace he now feels is a result of embracing both sides, the rational and the spiritual. As time passes, Raphael becomes more involved in his religious community. He participates in meetings that combine philosophical and spiritual debates, where he realizes that other people, like him, also face the dilemma of reconciling faith with logical thinking. These dialogues inspire you to seek a fuller life, where science and faith go hand in hand, each offering complementary answers to the great questions of existence. In his work, Raphael applies this new learning. When complex problems arise, he approaches them with the confidence that he doesn't need to have all the answers right away. He learned that, Just like in faith, the process of searching can be as important as the final solutions. This patience and humility transform the way you lead and collaborate with others, making you a person more appreciated by everyone around you. Raphael's spiritual journey also brings a new mission. He wants to share his story with those who face the same internal conflict between faith and reason. He goes on to advise friends and colleagues, showing how faith does not need to be seen as a weakness, but as an inner strength that completes the human being. For Raphael, spirituality is now a compass that guides his decisions and gives him hope in times of doubt. Finally, Raphael thanks God for the transformative experience that made him see beyond his own arrogance. He understands that without this divine lesson, he might never have discovered the true balance between what can be tasted and what must be felt. Your new path is one of gratitude, humility, and a renewed faith, which guides you in all areas of your life. Now he walks with confidence, knowing that both his mind and spirit are in harmony.